convoy. And it was in the middle. It was in the middle of the winter, and he said that was one of the hardest things that he ever experienced, because the sailors that had made it off the ship and into lifeboats, you couldn't stop to pick them up, you know. And you knew that in that cold water and cold weather and that, they would probably be dead in less than 10 hours. But he said if you stopped, your ship was vulnerable because they were stopped, and you left the other ships vulnerable because you were not in position to try and protect them.
Wow.
And he said that was so awful to see them in those lifeboats and know that they had no chance, you know, at all. That in a matter of hours they'd be dead from the frigid water and so forth.
Wow.
And no supplies and that. And he said, but you couldn't stop. He said you just had to go on and convoy the others. So he had been in service about 18 months. I'd finished college and I had taught school. And when they'd come into the ports, they would get leave, but to come to the middle of the United States like that, or come from, say, New York, clear to Montana, he would barely have had time to come home and have to turn around and get back because the airlines were not fully established. It was just railroads.
Yeah.
Or buses. And so he never could get home. Well, this one time they were changing some stuff on the ship and giving it a thorough overhaul, and he was going to be in New York for a week. It was usually less than that. So he sent me a telegram and said he was going to be in New York for a week, and I went back without any firm intention that we were going to get married, but I wanted to see him and see if I still felt the same way about him as I had when we were in college. So I went back to New York and we were married.
Wow. What did your parents think about that, though?
My mother wouldn't speak to me.
How did you get the money to go to New York?
Oh, I had money. I had been teaching, and I'd saved money.
Wow.
And my dad was much more considerate. When I was leaving, he asked me if I had enough money, and I said, I think so. And so he tore 2 or 3 check blanks out of his checkbook and handed them to me, and he said, if you run short of money, you can use these.
Wow.
He said, I'll be going into town within just a day or two, and he said, I'll tell Mr. Ruby at the bank that if these checks, any of these checks come in, to honor them.
Wow.
You didn't have account numbers or pre-printed checks. They were all blank, just blank checks. And he said, but I'll tell Mr. Ruby if any of these come in with your name on them, to honor them, that I authorized you. So that was kind of a cushion that I was very glad to have, though I never had to do it. But Trig and I were married in New York. We only had a few days. We were in a hotel, staying in a hotel, and then for a while he had to report back to the ship every morning, and then about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon where they'd give him shore leave for the night. So he'd come back and we'd go someplace and have dinner, go to a movie. We went to Radio City Music Hall and saw the Rockettes perform. That was a real treat. Servicemen were often given tickets to shows and that a lot through the USOs.
Oh, wow.
To attend these various functions. But he thought they were being sent to the Pacific area right then. So, and he didn't want me in New York by myself. So I went home, but they made 2 or 3 more crossings of the Atlantic, and then he came in again at Christmas time, and he was going to be in New York for 2 weeks. So I got on the train again and traveled for 3 days back to New York to spend Christmas with him. But then they were told they were going to ship out in just a few days, and they shortened their leaves, wouldn't give them any more than just an overnight, you know.
Yeah.
So I was staying in New York, and he thought he was going to leave about the 20th or 22nd of December. So he had a cousin and his wife who lived over in Brooklyn. Uh, his cousin was an importer, import-export, foods and lots of things. So Trig, I went over and stayed with them then, because they didn't want me staying in the hotel by myself over Christmas. And that was a nice time. Trig did not ship out, and we had a number of days there as their guests and spent our first Christmas with them. She was pregnant with her third child, and the day before Christmas I asked her, what I could do to help. She said, "Do you want to take the two children and go shopping with them, buy some presents for their dad?" And she said, if possible, just go shopping and window shopping and so forth, and keep them away from the house for 2 or 3 hours. It would be real nice. But they were two of the best behaved children I'd ever seen. And I know now what it's like to have children underfoot the day before Christmas or so, but I thought they were very well behaved children, and that she wanted that time, quiet time for herself, and to do things that maybe wrap presents for the kids and things like that she didn't want to do when they were in the house. So they knew their way around. They were not to go beyond certain areas, but you didn't let children go by themselves either.
Sure.
So I went with them, and we shopped for some things for their dad for Christmas and this and that. We had, for Christmas Eve dinner, we had reindeer steak.
Huh.
These were some of the delicacies, that he purchased, and people would go to his store and buy them. And what they called a lingonberry, which was somewhat like our blueberries, but not quite the same flavor and so forth. And they'd been imported too. I think they were imported from Canada. But we had a very nice time there with them, and then between Christmas and New Year's, just a day or two before New Year's, he did ship out. So when they were gone, he called me, and he said, "I won't be getting leave tonight." He said, I'll tell you that, and when I tell you that, that means we're leaving. Loose lips sink ships.
Right.
So that was his message, that they were shipping out.
And not to expect you to.
Not to expect him. So then I went to Cleveland. My brother Warren was stationed. Was stationed in Cleveland. He and his wife were living there. So I went to Cleveland and stayed with them for a short time. But their apartment was not.
Just the shower's a little noisy.
Oh, yeah.
Shower's a little noisy, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I need to be able to.
So, I got a job. You couldn't, there were lots of jobs open, but you had to go through a kind of a job service that you were more or less assigned to necessary jobs.
Oh.
And so I went to work doing secretarial work in a General Electric office. And I handled...
In New York or back in Montana?
In Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh.
And I lived at a YWCA, and went to work every day. Rode the streetcar, went to work. And there were 5 men in the office that I was their secretary for this group of 5. One was an engineer, and another one set up dealerships and so forth. And they traveled in this area of Ohio and Indiana and Virginia and West Virginia, and I think Kentucky too. So I would make, when they were traveling, I would make their train reservations and hotel reservations and so forth, and handle their mail when it came in. Any letters they wrote, they would transcribe them onto what they called a dictaphone.
Oh.
And then you'd use earphones, and you could take what they had dictated and type up the letters. So the first week or 2 weeks that I was there, I would type the letters, and address the envelopes and just put them on their desks, and they'd sign them when they came in for the weekend. Or Friday they'd be in the office, and then they'd sign all the correspondence and send it out. And when their paychecks came in or their travel reimbursements, I would take them to the bank that was nearby and deposit them. Things like this. When I'd go downtown to the railroad station to pick up their tickets, and then I laughed one time. I'd go down and I'd get the tickets and I'd come right back. You know, one of the men told me, he said, "You're entirely too efficient." He said, "It usually takes at the very least, 2 hours to make that trip downtown." Because that's what the other secretaries were doing, you know, and it had gotten to be the pattern. So it wasn't good for me to show that it should be done so much quickly, more quickly. So then there was one of the guys didn't have a real good sense of grammar and so forth. So I got so that I typed his letters the way he dictated them, but then often I would rewrite them the way I thought they should sound. And at first he was a little annoyed with it, you know. And then finally he said, "No, you're better at that than I am." He said, "So from now on," he said, "I'll just give you the name and the address and so forth, and just say, tell them da 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 da." He says, "'Cause you write a better letter than I do." And he said, "You may as well send them out, sign my name and sign your name underneath it, and mail them, get them in the mail." So I got so I was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And the secretaries they'd had were not very efficient. The files, all of the files of things were a mess. So when I wasn't answering the phones, I'd take some of these file folders out and straighten them up and get them reorganized alphabetically and this and that and the other. And it didn't take me long to get that done for the 5 of them either. And so then the boss came in one day, the supervisor, and I was sitting at my desk embroidering a pair of pillowcases. And he said, "Why are you doing that when you've got work to do in here?" And I said, "I don't have any work to do. All of the letters are typed. They're ready to go out." I said, "I've cleaned out all the files and rearranged them so they're in good shape." I said, "I can't find anything else in this office that needs doing right now, and I don't like to just sit here and twiddle my thumbs." So he didn't say anything much about it. Well, then a short time afterwards he said, "Would you mind helping one of the other departments out when you have some free time?" And I said, "No, what is it?" Well, they had an appliance repair shop in the building.
Had no plans for what?
Appliance repair.
Oh.
And people could send in toasters, coffee pots, waffle irons, you know, and the sort to be repaired. Well, they'd had a fire in part of their office, and the appliances were not all destroyed, but a lot of the correspondence was. And people started writing in, you know, asking why I hadn't gotten their coffee pot back or their toaster or whatever. And so when these people would write, then you'd write back to them and ask them if they could give you the model number and serial number and what kind of an appliance it was, you know. So then they would get appliances to send, new ones to send back to them to replace the ones that had gotten burned up in the fire. And so I did an awful lot of that kind of work too before. Well, then about April was when my brother Gene was shot down over France. And of course the folks, he flew a B-24 bomber, and there was a crew of 11. And the bomber was hit quite a few times with anti-aircraft shells, and the plane went down. They saw 5 parachutes come out of the plane, but no way of telling which ones of the crew members it was. So Gene had been burned. I noticed in Debbie's account of this that she said his boots were burned off, but they were not. But he wasn't wearing a regulation boot. They were just a kind of a slip-on ankle-high boot that he liked better than the lace-up boots they were supposed to wear, but were heavier and bigger and awkward. And so he was wearing these other boots. And when his parachute opened, his boots were jerked off. And he landed barefooted, and he did injure his feet. But his hair was burned. All of his hair was burned off. And, he had burns around his face and on his hands and that. And with the injured feet, the underground picked him up. But they said he was so badly injured and they couldn't take care of his burns and so forth. They said, you're going to have to give yourself up. They'll put you in a hospital. And Gene at first was afraid that, he'd just be shot. And they said, no, if you're foot soldiers, that might happen. But the Germans respect the airmen. So he gave himself up, and he was in a hospital for about 3 weeks. And then his burns healed, and he was in a prison camp with a lot of other pilots and crew people from the Air Forces. And the Red Cross sent us word, official word, but before that, there was a Red Cross worker who had been over in this area and came back to the East Coast, to Philadelphia, as a matter of fact, and Gene had told her that he was from north central Montana. So when she got back to the East Coast, she wrote a letter to the folks, and she just said, send it north central Montana. No town address or anything on it. But they used to sort the mail on the planes, on the trains rather, in those days. They had mail cars on the trains, and they sorted the mail on the car as they went along. And so as one of the postmen on the train had written on it, try Chinook.
Oh, how do you think they knew?
Oh, well, Dad had shipped, and your dad worked for the railroad, and my dad had shipped cattle on the railroad, and the only place they knew where there were failings was at Chinook and Havre, Montana. And so he wrote on it, try Chinook, so it got to the Chinook post office. And there, of course, they knew that Gene and my other 2 brothers were in the service, as well as my husband. And so it came on the route to the folks several weeks before they got the official notification that he was a prisoner of war.
Wow.
Strange, but because all she had was north central Montana, and then somebody on the train sorting mail said try Chinook.
Wow.
And it came through, right through. So then about every 6 weeks while he was a prisoner, we would get labels from the Red Cross, and we could send him a package. So it had to be a certain dimension and not over a certain weight. So we would collect small boxes, that would fit the length and girth. Had to be within a certain number of inches. So during this time, we would collect boxes that were approximate size, or were the size that were acceptable. And we would buy and save food, dried apples, dried apricots, raisins, not these Hershey candy bars, but semi-sweet Hershey in bigger bars that was not quite so sweet and would not melt or spoil as fast. And small tins of meat that we could send, tuna or things like this. And we always, then when we got the labels, we'd spend a whole day or more trying to see which box we could use and which box we could pack the fullest of the things that we had. Because you see, food was rationed to us at that time, and you were limited on buying certain things. So we all would use some of our coupons to buy certain things that Mother would want to put in the boxes and so forth, and we'd either mail them to her or take them when we went home. I was teaching at that time, so if I could found stuff in the stores that I could buy that I thought would go, I just buy them and then take them home the next time I went out to the range to see the folks. I taught at Saco, and then I taught, which was near Glasgow, and then I taught at Inverness, which was west of Havre, another small town. And so we would send these boxes. About every 6 weeks we'd get the labels and we could send the boxes. and I think Jean got a little over half of them. Someone else, they were stolen by the guards, camp guards and so forth, you know. The German, at that time, the German civilians were not eating much better than the prisoners. Food was very scarce. It was going to the troops. And what was left, what the people at home could buy, was often just what they could raise or what they could scrounge a little now and then.
Wow.
So you can't really blame them for what they did. But in the meantime, Trigg and my brother Warren and my brother Jerry were all out in the Pacific fighting the Japanese.
Oh.
Jean was on a Warren was on a battleship, and Jerry was captain of an LST. They called them large, slow targets. They were a rather slow-moving boat that was pretty much hollowed out and just packed full of tanks and jeeps and munitions and armament. And when they came to the shore, they had a kind of a ramp on the ship that would let down, and then these tanks and machines could just roll off and onto the shore if they could get close enough to get fairly close to the shore where they could, you know, they'd have to go in and almost ram onto the shore in order to let this ramp down and have ground that they could get off on. So, but that was what they called. There were a lot of smaller ships. There were PT boats and there were a lot of others, but these LSTs carried the heavy armament and tanks and things, and then all the boats and so forth, shells that they used. And Trick got his first leave. It was in July of 1945. They had come into Seattle and he came home. They were fitting the ships with additional armaments and so forth for planning the invasion of Japan. And they were told and trained that the Japanese people would fight so fiercely that when they got on Japanese soil, they would have to kill every man, woman, and child, because all of the civilians there were being trained to attack any soldiers, any ships, anyone who might come ashore. Yes, the whole Japanese kind of sticks or some kind of armament, sharpened sticks and that, and they said, you'll have to kill men, women, and children when we beach. So that was about the time, it was during this time while Trigg was home, that President Truman ordered that the hydrogen bombs be dropped. He was afraid the invasion of Japan would be such an absolute slaughter. And the bombs were ready, and he decided to drop them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after they dropped the second one, the Japanese decided to surrender. First time I saw my father cry was the day we got word that the war had ended. He had always been very stoic, you know, strong and stoic, and I had never seen him cry. And it's the first time I ever saw him more than a little happy with the liquor he consumed. Dad didn't drink a lot, but he always had liquor around. And he was just overjoyed. They knew by this time that the war in Germany had ended, and that they were back under the control. Jean, who had been a prisoner there, and a lot of those were back under military control. They'd overrun the prisoner camps. And then this ended the war in the Pacific. And Warren and Jean, and I was the only one of the girls whose husband was in the military. All of the rest of them had various jobs. that exempted them from service. Danny worked on the railroad. Pat's husband worked at Boeing. Pat did too, my sister Pat. Jimmy was an electrician in the shipyards, and that's Ursula's husband. So they all had wartime exemption jobs. So I was the only one whose husband was in service. But he had to go back to Seattle. He had to report in, even though they knew there wasn't going to be the invasion. He had to go back to Seattle and report in on his ship. And I had gone back to Seattle with him at that time. So when the war ended and they were disbanding, and they were discharged according to a number of points, depending on their rank in the military and how long they had served, and the type of service it had been. And ship duty gave you more points than a land station, and so forth. So he came up for a discharge and had enough points to be discharged, and he took it. He had tried several times to go to officer candidate school while he was aboard ship, and they always turned him down, the captain. Of course, Trigg was good in his work. He was a crew chief, and he was by that time a chief petty officer, which is the highest rank of the enlisted men. And they wouldn't allow him to go back or wouldn't authorize him to go to officer candidate school because he was so good at what he did on the ship. And they needed someone good on the sonar, the sound tracking of the submarines and so forth. So they turned him down. Well, when he had his points to be discharged, the Navy wanted to send him to what OCS, as they called it, Officer Candidate School. And he said, no, I wanted to go before, and you would never let me go. Would never clear my papers. And he said, no, I'm ready to get out. So we got word while we were in Seattle that his mother was not expected to live, so we left on the train and went back up to Plentywood, and his mother lived till about the end of September. And we stayed on the farm there with him. I helped take care of his mother. Used to swear that I never wanted to take care of anyone else dying of cancer, and I think I've spent half my life taking care of ill people like that. But we stayed there, and then he wanted to go back to Missoula to finish his training to be a pharmacist, but by the time his mother died, it was mid-quarter and too late to enroll for the fall quarter, so we were going to go back after Christmas, winter quarter. Well, Trigg had been away from his family all the time for so long, hadn't seen any of his sisters and brothers, and there was really not much point in going and renting an apartment somewhere. They had a big enough house by this time. We had one bedroom and just lived with his family, and that was not a good scene. I won't say any more.
His dad was really harsh.
Very harsh. Very harsh. I got along fine with his sisters and his brothers, but his dad was just impossible. So that's the way that went. And we went out after Christmas, right after Christmas, and started looking for a place to stay in Missoula. Fort Missoula was operational at the time, and the officers' wives had nearly all the apartments available in Missoula. So we were living in a hotel, but this wasn't going to be financially possible for very long. So we finally found a small house that was for sale, and had talked with the realtor and so forth, and then someone else, after we were able to finance the price they'd asked for it, and someone else came along and offered them several $100s more. Now, several $100s were like a few thousand now. Offered them more money for the house, and we weren't sure that they were going to accept our bid, and that. So our realtor said, I said, well, that's all the money we have to put down on it. That's just all we have. And I said, I don't think there's any place else, and I wouldn't want to borrow any more money, because we'd have to pay off the balance anyway. So he said, well, if they get offered more and take the offer, he said, I'll loan you the difference myself. And he said, then after you get well settled, or maybe even we'll wait till your husband gets through school. And he said, then I'll loan you the money and we'll work out some real easy terms for you to repay it. But we did get the house for what it had been priced and what we bid, so. And it was furnished. They had just come in from the coast, and then they wanted to go back, didn't find the job they wanted, or weren't happy in Montana. And they'd shipped their furniture to Missoula and didn't want to bother shipping it, have the cost of shipping it all the way back to the coast again, so they sold the house furnished. So he had a bedroom set, and a dining room table and chairs, and a couch and a chair in the living room. Couple chairs, I guess. So essentially the house was furnished. We had our own dishes and cookware that I had bought when I was teaching the second year, and had a part of a house where I did my own cooking and lived and so forth. So I had sheets and towels and things enough for me there, and that was practically all we had when we started out. It took a long time to get enough blankets and towels and things, because people that were going to give you a rain check were going to buy you a gift as soon as the things were available again. Well, those rain checks bit the dust because a couple of years had gone by, and we got very little in gifts. Not like girls do these days, a lot like any of my children did. They got enough stuff that were just completely ready to set up housekeeping. When Barbara and Dave were married and moved to an apartment in Missoula, they had everything. Everything. She said, I went downtown and bought a set of salt and pepper shakers. That was all I had to buy, she said, for our house. We had blankets, pillows, cookware, dishes, all your utensils. They had everything that they needed. Mm-hmm. She bought salt and pepper shakers. But we lived in Missoula from 45, beginning of 46, until the fall of 48. And Trigg finished his pharmacy school, and he took a year to take the courses. He thought he wanted to get a master's degree, and he took all of the coursework necessary for him, but he never got around to writing his thesis. And he got a job then in Billings working, and we moved to Billings. And they allowed them, I think, 3 years to get this thesis written and handed in. He'd done all the experiments, and he'd taken all the courses and that. But what I didn't realize at the time, though I knew Trigg's penmanship, well, his spelling and his grammar was not good. The idea of writing a thesis just was more than he could handle. And he kept putting it off and putting it off. If he had told me, I could have done it for him, because my grammar and English and spelling and vocabulary were excellent. Really excellent. But he never wanted me to help him. We'd never admit that it was the grammar and the writing and spelling for a finished thesis that just seemed to overwhelm him. And he let the time expire, so he never actually got his master's degree, although he told everyone he had. But we lived in Billings then. We had the 2 babies that were born in Missoula, Barbara and Larry. And while we were in Billings, Kenny and Judy were born. Judy was a year and a half old when we bought the store in Columbus and moved to Columbus. And we were there from 1955 on. So there were 3 houses in the town three houses for sale. One was a house that was smaller than the one we'd moved out of in Billings, had only 2 bedrooms, a full basement but unfinished, and I knew that my husband could not put up a partition or build a cupboard or anything of the kind. He was mechanically, he knew how to repair cars and things like that, but to build anything inside a house, he couldn't. And then there was what they called a stone house, and it was built out of quarried stone, but it was a big house and had not been well insulated, and the power bills on that would astronomical, even when it wasn't fall, wasn't wintertime. So we decided, and the price on that was a little more than we could handle because we had just bought the store. And so we bought the house that we had there in Columbus, that 3-story house. The couple who owned that worked for the bank and wanted to move back to one of the Dakotas or Wisconsin or something, where his family had some banking interests, and he was going into the family business. But we had to get a loan. We had our deal with Pop Lohmeyer, and we put money down on that, and then we would pay him so much. But we had to get another loan to make payments on the house. And I tried the various loan agencies in Columbus. The bank, who had not lifted a finger to help us find a place or anything, it was only the one bank here then, but they had a real estate agency in the bank. They called it the Harris Agency. And if we paid the Harris Agency a $500 commission, then they would give us the loan. And Rick says, well, I guess that's what we'll have to do. And I said, I don't think so. I said, they didn't lift a finger, and I'm not going to pay anybody for doing nothing for the privilege of serving us. So I went and talked to an insurance agent that was also a realtor, and I said, now the bank won't loan us the money. But I said, I think I can go back to Billings, to the loan agency that we made payments to in Billings, and I said, I think they'll carry this loan too. And he said, well, they usually don't cross into somebody else's territory, so to speak. So he said, but there's Empire Savings and Loan. It had been Empire Savings and Loan in Billings, and a branch of theirs was in Big Timber. And he said, let's see there if they will give you the loan. I think it was 4% or 4.5% interest. And because we had been at this Empire Savings and Loan in Billings, by the branch in Big Timber loaned us the money, or took the mortgage, and we paid on that till we got the house paid for. So then it was here ever since. Barbara and Larry had been born in Missoula, and then we had Kenny and Judy was only a year and a half old. She was born in 1953. She was a year and a half old when we moved here. Kenny was 3.
I don't know anything about Joe or Ruth.
Oh, my mom and dad?
Yeah.
Oh, well, let's go quite a ways back then. Dad was born in Canada. His grandfather had left Ireland in the potato famine, 1840. And their families usually came to Halifax, which was that's where the English shipped them to. Some of them were shipped to Australia. In one time, one shipload, they put the women and herded all these women, the English herded these Irish women and children down to the dock. And then they were going to put the women and children aboard one ship and the men on a separate one. And when they were protesting this, they said, you'll do what we tell you to do, or we'll shoot you on the spot. So the women and children were all put aboard one ship, and all their husbands were put aboard another ship, and the women were sent to the United States, to the east coast of the United States, and the men were shipped to Australia. And one of my great-grandfathers was one of those shipped to Mary O'Dwyer was her husband, and she was my great-grandmother, and her husband was shipped to Australia, and it took him 6 years of working and saving every penny that he could to get passage back to the United States to where thought he could try and find his family, and he eventually did find them, and then they moved up. There was more land available in Canada than in the United States. The east coast of the United States didn't want this influx of Irish, and so it was easier for them to get land and homestead and build a home in Canada, which they did. And my dad was born in Canada in 1880. Mother was born, Ruth Wood, was born in Michigan in 1887. She was the second from the youngest. And Dad was too. I think he had his brother Pat was younger than he was. Maybe Ambrose, I'm not sure. Maybe 2 younger brothers. But Dad was quite near the tail end of that family, too.
Where in Michigan?
It's a little town called Hersey, Hersey, in in my genealogy stuff, I've got the name of the county. Because when I decided that I wanted to join the DAR, Mother had always said we were eligible, but she hadn't joined, and none of her sisters or any other family that I knew of had ever joined. And I had to trace back 3 generations and get birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, and so forth. And it took me a number of years to do it. But when I wrote to Michigan to get my mother's, by this time she was dead, the clerk and recorder wrote back to me. I wanted to get Mother's parents, was what I had to have. He said that record is on page 1 on book 1 of our records. Page 1 of book 1, at the very beginning of their records. So I really lucked out there, because I had to have that as one of my documents.
What were her parents like? Do you know anything about them?
I don't know very much about her family. Her father was sent to prison when she was 18 months old. Got into a property dispute with his brother-in-law, his sister and brother-in-law, and he was sentenced to 10 years at hard labor. And my mother was born in March, and he was sent to prison in December and served 10 years. And of course, then when he came out of prison, he could no longer, he was a doctor. Dr. Eugene Halsey Wood, Eugene H. Wood. And he had gone to medical school in Europe, in Germany and France. And when the Civil War started, he was on the west coast of California. And there was quite a to-do about their enlisting, you know. He was at Sacramento, I think, when he enlisted. And they were given a bonus for enlisting, you know, $30 or $50 or something. And he enlisted. And then about the time he started training, the military officers found out that he had a doctor's degree, that he was a doctor. So they gave him an honorable discharge and gave him a commission as a doctor. So he was 32 or 34 when he married Sarah Adelia Warren. Her father was Mark Leonard Warren, and he went west to the gold fields and was never heard from again. Of course, those people were ill-prepared for what they were going into, and a good many of them died, and a lot of others were murdered, and they never found out what happened to him. So, they were living in, they got married and they lived in Michigan in this small town. And what happened, he came back there and was married and had a doctor's practice, but country doctors in those days didn't make much money, lived off the eggs and milk or so forth their patients brought. But doctors could have a still and make whiskey. And that's the way a lot of them did, and they could sell it medicinally. But they also sold it on the side, and a lot of it, and that was the way they mostly made their living.
Wow.
Well, his brother-in-law's lumberjacks used to come into town Saturday night and buy whiskey and sometimes get drunk and not get back to go on the job again on Monday. And so his brother-in-law sent in a goon squad and broke up his still and broke his whiskey barrels, destroyed them all. And in revenge, he went out and burned a couple of buildings at the sawmill, set fire to them.
Wow. It's a hot temper.
Huh?
Hot temper.
Yeah. But there was a trial, but when it came time for the defense, the brother-in-law, who was quite wealthy, and I can't tell you his name, it's in my records, had talked to the judge, bribed the judge, and the judge had ordered the sheriff not to serve subpoenas on the defense witnesses. And so when it came time for the defense, there were no witnesses in court. And the judge immediately sentenced him to 10 years at hard labor. And then, of course, coming out of prison, he was a felon, and he lost his doctor's license, his license to practice medicine. People are cruel beyond belief, and money and poverty have ruined so many families. You know, they did ours too. Our family.
Really?
After my father died, mother was very partial. And it went on. Oh, yeah. But that's a whole nother story.
I got time.
No. My parents, Carol, Wanda's mother, my sister Carol, married this Glenn Murphy. And the folks didn't like him at all. The Murphy family was considered kind of trashy. They were from West Virginia, Kentucky or something, you know. And the folks were just very unhappy with that marriage and wouldn't have anything to do with Carol. But Dorothy and I stuck up for her. She was married, went over to visit Dorothy and was married over there. And then I too took Carol's side. And I'm not sorry I did, even though it cost me a lot of money. It cost me an inheritance. I wouldn't do it otherwise, you know. Everybody needs somebody to stick up for them. And Wanda was born about 5.5 months after they were married. And my mother used that as her excuse for, and they had been married and everybody knew Dorothy and had arranged for their marriage over at Whitehall where she was living. And I was on her side too. So after my father had died, and then everything went to Mother, and she wrote Carol and Dorothy and me out of her will. She left us $10, so we could not attack the will, say that she had. If she had not put our names in and left us even that pittance, we could have fought the will and said, you know, that we were excluded and we shouldn't have been. So by leaving us $10, according to law, we could not, that was what she intended to do, was to exclude us from any inheritance. and we couldn't do a thing about it.
Sounds a little vindictive.
Very, very. So Dad had come out from Canada. His older brother Mike had come out ahead of him and had homesteaded here. And then he wrote back and he said, "Come west, there's land and grass aplenty." And so Aunt Bee came and Aunt Kate. These were my dad's sisters. And then Ambrose, Dad and Ambrose came. So there were 3 boys and 2 sisters of this family at Guelph that all came to Montana and homesteaded in practically the same area up in the Bear Paws and various parts there. Aunt Bee married John Rass, and they only had 1 daughter. Ambrose married a Thora Fremming, who was a nurse, Norwegian nurse. And Aunt Kate married Andy Moore. John and Bee Rass only had 1 daughter, Loretta. And when she married a man by the name of John Rush, who was a barber in Chinook. And they had 3 children, and I don't remember the names of those children right off. Ambrose and Thora had 3. There was Thora Margaret and Janet and John. They're all dead. But John, and I don't know what happened to Thora Margaret's family or Janet's. Johnny was the youngest of Ambrose's children, and he inherited the ranch. And then ran into trouble. His mother didn't like his wife. And of course they built a house there so that they weren't living in the same house, but the ranch was essentially hers. And so John married twice. In fact, he's married now for the 3rd, Ambrose, Johnny's youngest son, is married now for the 3rd time. He lives out near Helena, Montana. Kenny sees him, talks to him every once in a while. But it was all this control of, people get greedy. They want to control the property and the money and want everybody dancing to their tune. And so it causes a lot of damage in the families. There were 10 children in my dad and mother's family, Joseph Phelan and Ruth Wood. And there was quite a large family, 10 or 12 children in Aunt Kate's family. Now, of them, her children, her boys were old enough to have been my father. I remember some of them. There was Dick and Albert, who was called Ab, and Joe. And then there was, the oldest one in that family, I think, was Margaret. And then I knew a daughter whose name was Marie. And I just can't think of the names of the rest of them.
How did Ruth get from Michigan to Montana?
Well, she had a very, shall I say, an unhappy childhood. Not the, when her father came back, he couldn't practice medicine anymore. And I was told that his wife shut the door and wouldn't let him come in the house, wouldn't live with him or anything. Anyway, Mother graduated from high school there, and right out of high school, she wrote a teacher's examination. And if you could pass this teacher's exam, you could get a certificate to teach school. So, Mother and her sister Helen, who was just 2 years younger, I guess it was, and one of the older sisters, Um, I'll think of her name after a minute.
Sure.
All were teachers, and they taught in Michigan, and then they moved west to South Dakota and taught there. And then they all came on west to Montana and taught. Helen married and lived on a ranch near Butte. And my mother, they came by train to Fort Benton. And then Helen had married into this ranch family. Shut it off for just a minute while I think.
Sure. Well, I have plenty of tape.
No, I was trying to think of this older sisters of Mom. Because she was the only one of Mom's family that we knew. She married a man by the name of Robertson. I think I've got her name on some of those printed groups of papers that I had the other night up there.
It's awfully brave for them to just take off and teach across country at that time.
Mm-hmm.
What motivated them? I mean,
Well, I guess it was the frontier spirit. Probably a means of getting a homestead or land of your own and so forth. And in these small towns, after the scandal with their father's imprisonment and so forth, they didn't want to stay around home. So they left. They moved away to strike out on their own. And I think Helen filed on a homestead. My mother did. She filed on a homestead, I think, shortly after she and Dad were married, because her homestead adjoins his. And
I heard there was quite a story with her homesteading, that she was the first married woman to homestead or something.
Mm-hmm. She was. And the land agent, who was the neighbor there, who made out the certificates, didn't want to let her homestead because she was a married woman.
And only single women could, or?
I guess so. Mm-hmm. And so Mother appealed it to the State Land Board and was turned down there, so she appealed it to the Secretary of the Interior and got a ruling that married women could file on homesteads.
Now that's a pretty unusual thing
That's
to do.
a very unusual thing.
And how did that happen?
Well, she just wrote the letters herself and appealed, mailed them in as an appeal. And got the ruling from the Secretary of the Interior that married women could file on homesteads.
Wow.
And could file, sometimes adjoining, besides their homestead, they could file on what was called a desert claim. This was maybe a chunk of land that wasn't quite as fertile or didn't have as good a water supply and so forth, and it was called a desert claim. It was good mostly for pasture, for animals. And she filed on that, and she went through the same process filing on this desert claim and appealed that and got the ruling that she could apply for a desert claim.
Wow.
Mother's oldest brother was a lawyer.
Oh, I didn't.
I never met him, but her oldest brother Robert was an attorney in Chicago.
Robert Wood?
Mm-hmm.
How many siblings did she have?
Oh, let's see. The one I was trying to think of, Aunt Winnie.
Winnie.
Winnie married Ivan Robertson, and they lumbered up in the Shelby area, and there were a lot of forest land there. I knew I'd think of it after a while. It was Winnie, and she was the only one of Mother's sisters and brothers that I ever got to know very well. Winnie and Ivan would come once in a while, and their son Robert was just a little bit younger than my mother, and he was probably kind of a favorite nephew of hers. Anyway, I think there were 11 or 12. As I say, I think Winnie was the oldest. Mother was second from the youngest. There were, Mark was a twin. His twin was dead at birth.
I'm surprised that you didn't know any of her relatives very well.
Well, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't remember them ever coming to visit very much. Willard and Mark both went to the West Coast. They lived in Seattle. And I think they had families there and probably died there. If you could wanted to go back to the King County records, because that's where Sarah Delia died there too. As she began getting older, and that she went out to live with one of her sons, either Mark or Willard, and I don't remember which one it was that did it. She turned over her property, title to her property and money and so forth to him to take care of her. And as soon as he got control of her property, he put her in the county poor farm. And she died in the poor farm.
And this was the Robertson? Sarah Delia Robertson? Is that her name?
Yeah, Sarah Delia Wood.
Wood.
She was a Warren before she was married, and she married Dr. Wood, Dr. Eugene H. Wood. So there's been, and I always told my kids when they were growing up and that, I said, if I ever think...
So you were going to tell me about how your parents met and married.
Oh, well, my dad, Joe Phelan, was one of the ones who came out from Guelph to homestead here, because Mike had written, his older brother Mike had come out first, and said that there was land and grass aplenty. So Dad came, and his brother Ambrose, his sister Kate, and his sister Beatrice, his Aunt Bee. And they all pretty much filed on adjoining land. The land from Ambrose and Mike and my dad's filed on adjoining claims so that their land joined, and then Mother's was just east of Dad's. Bee and John were just to the north of Dad and Mother. I don't know exactly where the lines went, but they were on a ranch that was just north of Dad and Mother. And so there were, Aunt Kate was some ways away, over on Cow Creek, about 8 miles away, but the others, their land had joined. And eventually, I don't know why they sold, but Bee and John sold their land and moved into town. And Aunt Bee, I guess, used to board some of the teachers, ran a kind of a boarding school, and I said, well, what did Uncle John do? And
I think we got power. Hello? Who's out there?
Hi.
Hi, Mom. We're getting some stories.
Great,
Yeah.
great.
um,
We're thinking about taking a ride to the ocean. Do you want to come in a little while?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks. All right. So Aunt Bee used to board teachers?
yeah, she boarded teachers, and I said, well, what did Uncle John do? Did he have a profession or some job? And I think it was Jean that told me, my brother Jean, said he played cards. He was a gambler.
And good enough at it?
And a good enough at it to pretty much make a living, I guess. But they only had the one daughter, Loretta. And then she married a barber. His name was Dick Rush. And I don't know the names of those Rush children. I know there was a girl and 2 boys.
And Uncle John, when he was quite a bit older, had a stroke, but there were no such things as nursing homes in those days. And so Aunt Bee was taking care of him, bedridden as he was, in their house. And Loretta used to send the girl over every day as soon as she got home from school to check on her grandmother, see if there was anything she needed from the store or something or other. And she found her grandmother dead on the kitchen floor.
Oh, that's too bad.
And they moved. I was in college at Havre at this time, so it was perhaps 41,
Yeah.
1941. And they moved John up to the hospital at Havre until Aunt Bee was buried. And then when the family went to the room to tell him, you know, that she had died and they were going to make different arrangements for him, and so forth, the next day they would have their plans finished and would come and get him from the hospital and move him. And he died that night.
Mm.
And was buried just a couple of days later. So that my Aunt Kate lived to be quite old. She was a darling. I just loved her. For she was my godmother. But she used to do a lot of nice things for us. Every fall she would come over, the end of August, early September, and she would have a shoebox or so, box full of knitted mittens for every one of us.
Wow.
And my mother had a Warren sent $100 any month, but he made them out to me. And I always wrote on the check for Jack Donegan when I cashed him.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just put the money in an envelope there in the store. And I tell him, I said, you can take it now, or it's here anytime you need it. And he said, oh, I better keep some of that in reserve, Andy. He said, I got this other stuff straightened up and I'm getting more money now. He said, I'm not quite so hard up, but I said, okay. But that much is coming from Warren, and you don't have to worry about paying it back, and that much is coming from Jerry, and you don't have to worry about paying that back either. So he finally got through. Started his own company, was doing great guns. Got cancer. Died when he was about 2 weeks past his 40th birthday.
Wow. What was his company?
It was a company that supplied first aid equipment and fire extinguishers to small businesses. We had a couple of big contracts too. But I'll just take a couple. I don't know how much I should really be eating.
Oh, okay.
And he got so they had, I think, about half a dozen employers working for him. 3 or 4 trucks traveling around the state in Idaho and Wyoming and Montana.
You know, Sarah wanted you to tell me the horse story on the ranch. About the team of horses?
Oh, that's this pair of blacks, and I told her
Oh,
about
yeah,
them.
with the backing up?
Yeah. And I told you the one about me riding the horse through the house.
Mm-mm.
Didn't I? Danny got me a pony, a Welsh pony.
Huh.
The doctor, Dad was concerned about me. I wasn't growing. I suppose this day and age they'd call me a child who failed to thrive.
Mm.
Joyce was as big as I was, and she was almost 4 years younger.
Wow.
And the doctor said, get me a horse to ride. Get me outside. Have me come down to the barn and take care of my horse before breakfast. Maybe I'd be a little hungrier for breakfast. Take me out working with him out in the fresh air, and maybe I'd get hungry enough to eat. But I always had some snacks with me too. And when we go in for supper, Papa take me on his lap He always drank a bottle of beer before supper at night, his home brew. And he'd make me come sit on his lap and he'd feed me beer. I hated the stuff. I just absolutely hated it.
Hmm.
But I had to drink it. You know, a certain amount. Not a lot, but some. I think I weighed about 95 pounds when I was a sophomore in high school. I stayed home my freshman year of high school, too. And when I went to academy as a sophomore, I think I weighed 95 pounds.
Wow.
Came home at Thanksgiving time and I weighed 115. So you know how my clothes fit me. Mother spent the whole of the vacation
Adjusting the clothes.
letting out my clothes. But anyway, I rode this pony all the time. I went out from Dad to when he was feeding the cattle and all of this. When he was fencing, I was with him. Everything. Spent most of the rest of my life from the time I was about 8 till I left for college out with Dad. Not working in the house doing dishes or anything like that. Because Dad said when I worked outside all day I didn't have to do housework too. And Ursula hated that. Because in the evening after supper I could sit and she had to go do the dishes. Maybe it wasn't fair. But for 4 years then, I raked all the hay that they stacked. I rode the hay rake. The other ones were buck rakes that they used to bring the hay in after it was raked into windrows or cocks and brought it into the stack. They were buck rakes, and the time I rode was just a hay rake, and it was about 10 feet wide. The sickles that they had on the moors were 5 foot, so I raked 2 rows of what they had mowed. And first you'd rake it into windrows, and then I'd come along and bunch it. But I had to always be careful to drop the bunches where they were on level ground so that they could pick them up easily with the buck rakes. So there had to be done right.
So you did better after you got your horse.
Oh yeah. I started gaining weight and I was outside and I wasn't being picked at as often. Mother used to leave me at the table to finish my dinner, and I'd sometimes be sound asleep or sitting there till 2:30 or 3:30 in the afternoon. And if Dad came around and it was an hour past dinner and I was still sitting at the table to finish my plate, he'd take it and scrape it in the dog's dish. If I couldn't eat it within an hour, you know, that was as far as it went.
Did she know that he did that?
I guess so. But she would still make me sit. Sometimes he wasn't around to come in. And I'd have to try and sneak off myself and dump it in the dog's dish, get back and sit in the chair until I had cleaned my plate, or eat part of it. I just remember Dad taking my plate quite a few times. If he was out working around the buildings or working with the horse, coming in and taking my plate and dumping it in the dog's dish so I wouldn't have to sit at the table all afternoon.
So you rode your horse through the house?
Mm-hmm.
Tell
My
me
pony.
Tell me this.
Oh. Well, one of my chores then when I got the pony was to ride her down 3/4 of a mile from the house down to the county road and get the mail. Usually came in about 11:15, 11:30. The mailman came out the road. Well, this day, for whatever, he was late. And I'd already made 3 trips to the mailbox that morning between 10 and noon to get the mail, and he wasn't there. And Mother was just about ready to take up dinner, and everybody was in, ready to sit down to dinner. And my mother said, "You go get the mail, and I want it right here on the corner of by my plate. Go and get it." Everybody else was just ready to come in and sit down and eat. Here I was, going to the mailbox again. Dinner'd be cold when I got back, you know. And she said, you go get the mail. So I went and got the mail. Put it in a sack. Brought it home. Put it on the corner of the table. Walked my horse in the gate. Up the walk, up the steps. 3 steps, up across the porch. Opened the living room door. Rode my pony in across the living room. Laid the mail down by my mother's plate. Went behind her chair and out through the kitchen. And out through the back porch, which was the washroom. Headed for the barn. I got as far as the back gate. And my dad came out the back door. Just 1 minute, young lady. And I thought, oh God, the roof was going to come in, you know. He said, why did you do it? And I told him. Because they were all sitting around the table and they'd all finished eating by the time the food was cold. We didn't have microwaves by the time I got back with the mail from Mother. And he said, don't do it again. That's all he ever said to me.
What did your mom say? Weren't you afraid she was going to tear you apart?
No.
Yeah?
I think probably Dad told her not to be so unreasonable about my going and getting the mail. Sending me off just when it was time to sit down and eat dinner. Don't send her off to do that when dinner's practically ready and everybody's gonna. She was right. Everybody was going to eat and the food would be cold by the time she got back. Don't do that to her.
And your
And
dad,
my mother didn't.
your dad had enough pull that your.
Oh yes. When Dad spoke, that was it. He let an awful lot go, but when Dad laid down the law, that was it.
That was mighty uppity of you, though, to ride your house.
Wasn't it awful of me?
How old were you?
Oh, 9 maybe.
Had some spunk and some spirit in you.
But I told you about did I tell you about the wagon wheel rolling up on Dad's back?
Yeah.
Well, that was the black team that he had trained and were such good horses. And when he spoke to them, well, most of the horses were pretty good. This black team, always. When he spoke, they stopped on the dot. That was the team he drove when my sister Patty broke her leg in the middle of the winter.
I didn't hear that story. She broke her leg?
Pat's horse fell. Saddle horse she was riding fell with her, and her leg got caught under the horse and broke it in 3 places.
So the horse fell on her?
On her. Feet slipped on the ice and fell, and she didn't think to get her leg out of the road. So, Jerry was with her. Dad usually sent 2 of us kids together. He very seldom sent one youngster out by themselves. For safety's sake, he sent 2. So Jean was with her, and so he unsaddled both horses and put one saddle blanket on the ground, and kind of moved Pat over onto it and used the one saddle for a little bit of a windbreak for her, covered her up with the other saddle blanket, and then rode his horse lickety-split back to the buildings. They were up at Mike's place riding. And we saw him coming. And just the one rider, Dad knew something had happened. And by the time Jean got to the barn, Dad was down at the barn, had his team hitched to the bobsled, and had forked a bunch of hay into it and came up to the house. And he told Mother to get some quilts ready and some irons warm if she could. And he went out to get her. brought her back in the bobsled, and they splintered her leg. Never even brought her into the house. Splintered her leg, and ready to go to town with her. She had to go to town. That leg was broken in 3 places. And oh, there was deep snow, and my mother said, "Joe, if you drive those horses to town, you'll kill them after you've fed cattle all morning on them." He said, "If I kill them, I kill them. I'm taking her to town. She's got to be in a doctor's care." So he said, "I'll stop at Joe Putvis." He said, "He's the only one that's got good horses." He said, "If I can get a team from Joe, or trade teams, take his and leave mine, I'll do it. Otherwise, I'll drive my own all the way in." Well, he did trade with Joe Putvis. Got to town about midnight or a little after, left the ranch about 4 in the afternoon, and got to town about midnight with her. The doctor set her leg, and she stayed in town. This is where Aunt Bee and Uncle John lived. So he took her to, after the doctor put the cast on her leg, Dad took her to Aunt Bee's house, and she stayed at Aunt Bee's for about 2 months. Couldn't come out to the ranch till her leg was all healed. The doctor said it was healed and well enough for her to go. So, yeah. I was raking hay one summer, and Jean was cutting. Jean always did more of the hay cutting than anybody else, I think. And I raked. Well, we were going up into Dad's homestead, which was a couple miles from the house. And Jean had sharpened a couple extra sickles. These were the bars that you put in, and they had the pointed things to cut the hay. And he sharpened a couple sickles, and he wanted me to take them and leave them in a certain place at another patch of ground that they were cutting for hay. So I had these 2 sickles with all these sharp things. The middle section of it was wrapped with a couple gunny sacks untied, but the ends of them were sticking out and sharp as paring knives. And I was driving a team that was a bay and a gray. My gray was a good horse. This bay was had been a saddle horse, but she bucked too much, too often. So they decided they'd put her on the rake, wouldn't use her for a saddle horse. Well, she rubbed her bridle off, broke the throat latch, caught it on the tongue, broke the throat latch, and rubbed her bridle off. She looked back and saw the rake, and she started running across the hayfield. And I thought, oh, God, how am I going to get these horses stopped? You know. Well, the first thing I knew I had to do was get rid of those sickles. So I swung them around so that they were parallel. And then I threw them behind me, dropped them off, so that neither the horses nor me nor anybody else get caught up in those. Hello, how's Jordan?
Good.
Good.
Who's in there with you?
Kim?
It's me.
Can I come in?
No, we're talking.
Who's Kim?
Kim? She's another one of the ladies here, one of the cousins here.
Hey, Jordan.
Hey.
Did you get a wiffle ball?
No.
A bat?
No.
Okay. So I headed the horses across the field, and there was, where the hay part ended, was quite a steep hill. No trees on this side,
but thick timber on the north side. So I headed them up this hill, and I could only control the one horse. And by either whipping her to make her go faster, or pulling on the rein, I could turn her. And I whipped both of them just as hard as I could up this fairly steep hill, so that they'd be out of breath when they got to the top of the ridge. And that they'd, solid trees, when they couldn't go anyplace, they'd stop to try to catch the wind, and then I figured I could get them tied to one of the trees, which I did. I jumped off the rake and went up beside Widow and got her halter rope and tied it to one of the trees, and then I got Kat's halter rope and tied her, and then I took the throat latch off Widow's bridle and put it on the other one, which is a stronger throat latch, and put the other bridle back on, put the other throat latch on it, and you always had a couple pieces of baling twine along. For some reason or other, you always carried baling twine. And so then I used baling twine to make a throat latch for Widow, because she wouldn't try to rub hers off or anything like that. She didn't need much to keep it on. But Gene came along and saw me up on the top of this ridge, and he let out a holler, and he said, "What you doing up there? The hay's down here."
So how did Danny get into the family?
Oh, Danny worked for Dad several winters. He'd sometimes work for Red Rings or Lawlers or some of the other ranchers over on Beaver Creek. But as soon as the haying was done and the haystacks were fenced and this and that and the other, some of them didn't need a hired man, and they'd let him go. Just tell him they didn't need him, and you know.
Yeah.
And he'd work for my dad in the wintertime. Well, he didn't make an awful lot of money, but it was bed and board, and probably about $10 a month, which about take care of your tobacco or something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd work for my dad. And then he got to working summers year-round for my dad, and Dad'd pay him more in the spring when there were the cattle to take care of. In the summer when we were haying, he'd drive a mower usually. He wasn't quite strong enough, or didn't think it. Well, I guess he might have done that to the buck rakes. You had to have real strong legs to lift those teeth up in that hay. Hello?
Hi.
Tim was hungry.
Hey,
It's the only
Thank
bread
you.
I could find.
perfect. Thanks a lot. You had to have real strong legs to...
Yeah, because you had to, there were some levers you had to put your feet on and pull them down or push them some way to lift those teeth up so that you could carry the hay in from the field to the stack. And then there was another lever that you used to push the hay off. Pat used to do it, Dorothy did sometimes. Jerry used, no, I think Jerry mostly mowed. After the other 2 or 3 girls got quite a bit older, then Jerry did a variety of things in the hay fields. Ursula never worked in the hay fields at all.
Why not?
She didn't know how to handle horses. And she wasn't always alert enough. It wasn't safe to put her on a mower. And she raked part of one summer, and she didn't. When Ursula didn't want to do something, she'd do a poor enough job that they wouldn't try to make her do it.
And nobody, people tolerated that?
It wasn't really obvious, but she'd miss streaks of hay in the field, you know, instead of keeping her one wheel far enough over that she was catching both of the rows. And she'd bunch it sometimes and bunch it in a kind of a hollow where it was hard to pick it up. They could pick it up maybe, but they'd leave about maybe a third of the bunch on the ground.
and this and that. Oh, she was handy with her little tricks. Hello?
Hi.
Were you wanting to go to mass?
I'll stay.
You doing okay?
Yep, I'm doing okay.
Alright.
Well, I think we're probably going to take this wee one. He seems to have picked up a few bug bites.
Oh, looks like it.
Take him down the mountain and
Gives
into a
out.
cool car. So, you
Okay.
doing alright?
Oh, I'm still going.
Okay.
Should she be eating like bread or crackers or anything?
Soda crackers. And salty
See.
she could have.
I
They
have
bought me a couple these
Triscuits.
Triscuits.
I'd be really tender with them. They've got the sodium that you need though. There's just a lot of fat in it.
Actually, I got the reduced fat kind.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Good girl.
They're right
Okay.
here. And I thought the fiber might be helpful.
Maybe.
Okay.
A couple of them aren't going to hurt.
A couple of them probably won't hurt you a bit.
Okay, dear.
I wasn't too excited about the mass anyway.
Hmm? Oh.
But you were saying how Ursula had tricks to get out of doing her work.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she did. She and I slept together. And Ursula used to wet the bed. And instead of getting up when she had to go in the middle of the night, she'd push right over to the middle of the bed or so, and then she'd wet. So this left this outside edge of the bed dry for her, and almost nothing over here that was dry where I could sleep.
And she did it on purpose?
Of course she did. She denied it, but of course she did. She pushed me down the basement steps one time and locked the door on me. If that had been concrete instead of dirt, I'd have probably gotten hurt.
Wow. You guys had a real rivalry?
Oh, I think she didn't like me from the day I was born.
She was older?
Older.
Mm.
And she ate a lot, and she grew fat. Her nickname when she was a kid wasn't very nice, but everybody called her Chubby. And then here I was, this petite little thing. And I don't, sometimes my mother didn't care. I sometimes thought that my dad let certain things happen. Now he allowed my brothers to turn those colts loose, you know, that were the colts of the rake mares, so they'd come and suck, and then I couldn't get my mares into their stalls to eat their hay. You know, be 10-15 minutes late getting them in. They thought the boys thought it was funny, and Dad never made them stop.
Mm.
You know, and I think he should have. But there were things like that that went on in the family. Dad used to tease us a lot. Good-natured teasing, but sometimes there was a little bit of a bite to it. And he always said that he was rounding off our corners so we'd get along in the world better. You thought you had to learn to take this teasing and remarks made every once in a while and not get angry and offended at it. I don't know that it worked very well.
Well, what would you say are some Phelan family characteristics?
strong-willed, particularly the women, determined, independent, for all of us girls, Dad said that we had to go to college or a trade school or something and support ourselves for a year before we got married. Once you had supported yourself for a year, you knew you could. And if anything ever happened, you knew that you could work and take care of yourself. And that was his hard and fast rule for any of us getting married. You had to work for at least a year. And
What, what could he do if you said you didn't want to?
you did. We went to college. Ursula went to beauty school. Failed. As soon as she got out of beauty school, she started earning money. She started charging till hell wouldn't have it. 2 or 3 of the stores in Missoula were all set to sue her. The folks went over and bailed her out. Brought her back to Havre, and she worked in a beauty salon there in Havre for a while, and then opened her own in the Havre Hotel. I don't know whether the folks helped her with it or not. They never let the other children know what they did for one or another. That was their dealings with that child. That was as far as it went.
That's a little weird, huh?
Mm-hmm. Because just before the folks had gone and bailed Ursula out, Dad had let me write checks on his bank account for my expenses. And this trip that I made over to Missoula, I wrote a check to pay for my ticket. And when I was in Missoula, I wrote a check to give Joyce some money because she was broke. And then one time I'd been sick, and one of my friends went down to the drugstore to get some cough drops and some cough medicine and stuff for me. And I wrote the check out to her. So when she stopped my checking account, she told Dad I'd been abusing the checking account, loaning money to my friends.
Who told you that?
Mother told Dad that.
Did you have a chance to set it straight?
I did. I didn't at the time, but I did later. He said, I wish you had come and told me this immediately. He said, I'd have probably put some money in an account for you all by yourself. But you know, you don't disbelieve your parents or your mother when you're a kid growing up. Your tendency is to do what they say, mind what they say, so forth. And it wasn't until I was several years older than that and started looking back on some of these things and realized that my mother shaped the truth to suit her own means. Like when Ursula and I left the academy after Ursula had been in the Stockman bar, and that was reported to the nuns and so forth, and they weren't going to give her her diploma. Dad didn't know anything about that for 3 months. So it was time for me to go back to school again at the academy, and I didn't want to go back because of the fiasco that had been, and I knew the nuns would just make life hell on earth for me. And I told Papa if he made me go back to the academy, I'd run away.
So what exactly happened?
I went to live with Dorothy for a year. She said she'd take me, keep me with her for the year. I graduated from Glendive.
What happened with the bar?
Well, the nuns knew that somebody called from the bar, somebody that knew that they were Ursuline students. That was the Saturday that the Catholic students had their prom from the 3 Catholic high schools in Great Falls. So a girl dressed in a prom dress, was from one of the Catholic schools. And somebody called the academy and reported it, that Ursula had been in the bar.
And was Ursula a little wild?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Ursula always drank.
So where did Dorothy live?
Dorothy was working in Glendive, and she had an apartment there. She had graduated from college, and she was working as a welfare supervisor in Glendive. And the boys could have 4 years of college funds. The girls could only have 2, and if we wanted more than 2, we had to pay for it ourselves. Which wasn't fair, but that's the way it went. Boys, you know. Girls get married. It's a shame to waste college on girls. They just get married and start having babies. Was the prevailing view. Not just of my folks, but of a lot of people. Why waste money sending girls to school? So, Dorothy owed the folks some money, and not a lot. I'm sure it cost her more than that to have me with her for the whole year. But she said instead of paying them back the cash, she'd take me and keep me all year with her, and I could graduate from school there. I enjoyed it, my first year in public school. Got good grades, fairly good grades. My first year in public school was my senior year in high school.
Was it better than the nuns?
Oh yeah, yeah. I had a good time that year. But I wasn't the valedictorian, like I would have been at the academy. Would have gotten scholarships for college. Because there were 112 students. There were only 12 in my class at the academy. And I was the top student. And I graduated 8th out of 112. I didn't think that was too bad. But I didn't get any scholarships. My mother figured every angle she could to save them, to avoid having to spend money on us. And if I'd gotten a scholarship, that would have been that much less that they'd had to pay toward my advanced education. And I've been getting good grades. I got straight A's at the academy. I never wrote a semester or a final exam the 2 years I was there. Because I got A's. If you got A's for the 3 6-week periods of the semester,
Then you didn't have to.
then you didn't have to write the semester exam. I never wrote a semester exam. Except in Latin. And I shouldn't have had to write that. But we were translating the Latin of Caesar's Gallic Wars. But had a good foundation in Latin, and like anything else, it was not hard for me. And I usually got 100 on my translations of our Latin. And I had let a friend of mine borrow them to study from it, because mine were all correct. Well, she got caught cheating with some of my translations. And the sister made me write the final exam. I don't know why I should have had to write an exam because somebody else cheated. I gave it to her for study guides. And so all of the other kids had gotten to retranslate one that we had already done. I got one that I'd never seen before and had to translate it. And I was so angry because I thought it was unfair that I should have had to take the exam or do the translation anyway. And I made up my mind I was going to do it perfectly, which I did. Not only were the words and the verbs in the right tenses and so forth, dotted every I, crossed every T, put every period in its place. And she gave me a 95. There wasn't one red check mark. But this was punishment. And she gave me a 95. And those kind of things happening in your life that I think were unfair. I have probably a very rigid belief of right and wrong.
And those kind of things happening in your life, they do what?
The things like this that happen in your life shape your character. They help you establish your morals. They're your guides in working with other people if it's right or it's wrong. You don't punish unduly. You don't play favorites. You deal fairly with everybody that you are associated with or those that you're supervising. You might be what people call straight-laced. But I was, and I was always fair. No one ever accused me of being favorites when I was teaching or in dealing with my own children and so forth. I didn't have favorites. I'd seen it happen in our family, and I was not going to do it. And I wasn't going to let Trig do it either. The firstborn son in Norwegian families has a rather privileged place. The firstborn son in a lot of families. Royalty. German, Italians, a lot of others. You know.
1 second. Hey, you guys, you're being awfully loud, and we're trying to record in here, so if you can put it down a little bit, that'd be helpful. Thanks. All right. Firstborn sons.
There's a sociology term that's used to describe this, and it's called primogeniture. Primogenitore. And it's the privileged place of the firstborn, particularly, more often the firstborn son. The oldest son always was the king. The oldest son inherited the land. The oldest son got the business. And this is the way. This was an established procedure. And it went on through the centuries.
So, with Trig, did he have a firstborn son?
Larry was the firstborn. He was much more lenient with Larry than he was with Kenny. Trig was the firstborn son. And his father was. So I got a double dose of it when I married Trig. And I used to see some of these traits in Warrens. They have this attitude of the king can do no wrong. You know. Warren used to be very arrogant. Very arrogant. He was right. Anytime there was a discussion or anything else came up with any of his sisters and brothers, that he was right. You were automatically wrong because you thought differently. You could be 99 9/10% right, but you were still wrong if you differed from him. And Warren had somehow had these jobs that he worked at in the government where he somehow got into supervisory positions. You know? And he worked governmental jobs most of his life.
Yeah, was he the one who went to Washington? And
No, Jerry went to Washington Law School. George Washington Law School, that was Jerry.
Can we go down from the top to the bottom of the kids and tell me what they were like and how they ended up and what their major characteristics were?
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, if it's,
No,
I can never
it's
keep-
my opinion that if people would agree with me, this is how I saw it.
Uh-huh.
Warren was the firstborn. He was, as I say, treated as the firstborn, was quite arrogant in his behavior, was always arrogant. The best was none too good for him. And he got 4 years of college. All paid. He didn't have to work boardroom or much of anything, like some of the rest of them. Jean also got 4 years of college, but Jean also had a beautiful voice, took voice lessons. And then then when Jerry was in college, he was in Missoula about the same time Jean was, or for part of the time. And the two Phelan brothers and the two Dahlstrom brothers sang in a quartet that was outstanding, just outstanding, you know. I can remember when Jerry was in high school and they were putting on an opera in the high school, the music teachers were. And they put on the Mikado. And the teacher wanted Jerry to take a certain part. It wasn't the lead role, but a supporting role, but a little more difficult to sing. And now Jerry wanted the lead. And if he didn't get the part he wanted, he wouldn't be in it. So he got the role he wanted. They were this way. They were taught to be this way, arrogant and demanding.
By your mom or by your
By
dad?
our mother.
Why did she like the boys so much?
I don't know. She liked the boys so much. But especially Warren was. And he never would, if he could avoid it, get some kind of a summer paying job. He never would come home and work on the ranch in the summertime, helping put up hay and things like that, like all the rest of us children did. Jean came back and worked at the ranch in the summertime, so did Jerry. The girls did. Dorothy did. I don't recall Miriam doing it. She might have been home. If she was, she worked in the house around that. She didn't work in the fields. Dorothy did and Patricia did. They worked buckwheats when we were haying. Dorothy was always very, very kind. She had such a sweet disposition and kind, and was always trying to be good to the younger ones or arrange things, treats for them and this and that and the other. Pat was the same way with us younger girls. Always on our side and trying to kind of protect us. And used their wages to buy things for us that Mother wouldn't buy for us. Pat bought clothes for me when I was in college, so did Dorothy. They were very kind dispositions. I think Pat was in a way too kind. I think her children took advantage of her kindness. Because they were arrogant little snips, those three of Pat's. It was hard for the girls to get married. My mother didn't approve of any of her son-in-law. She didn't like any of them. None of the men were good enough for her daughters. None of them. She would not put on a wedding for us or help us in any way with it. The only wedding she went to was Joyce's. And Joyce made it almost impossible for her not to, because she invited Archie and Sadie, who were these dear, dear, old friends of the Foxes. And she said, told them, she said, it's going to be kind of hard to explain why you're not there when Archie and Sadie are coming. So Mother and Dad went to Joyce's wedding.
But she didn't. If she liked the boys so much better than the girls, then why did she care who the girls married? I mean, if she didn't.
Well, as long as we were not married, she felt she had a certain call or demand on what money we earned. She didn't want us getting married, really, because she could always get her to buy this or buy that, or will you pick this up, or will you, you know. And she did it to all of us. Until we were married, she felt she had control, or anything she asked us to buy or pick up in town or get or give to her or to one of the younger ones was okay.
So it was about power and control.
It was power and control. And until we were married, she exercised that over us. And I think that there may, and I don't know for sure, but I think there may have been at least a couple of these marriages where they got married just to get out from under that thumb. So,
What would happen if you just said no, that you weren't going to spend your money on her?
oh, she had a way of asking in ways that made you feel guilty if you didn't. You know,
Yeah.
you somehow owed it
To her.
to her to do these things she wanted. Because, according to her, she had done so much for us. So she made us feel as if we owed it. And that we're being very ungrateful if we didn't comply with her wishes.
Did your dad ever get involved with that kind of stuff?
No, I don't think so.
He just kind of stayed out of it.
He just kind of stayed out of it. Like I said, his rule was that we support ourselves for a while so that we know that we can, and then if we want to get married, that's our business. He was kind of upset when Dorothy married John Donegan, who was disabled. He had lost a hand gotten shot in the wrist or the hand, and his left hand had been amputated as a result of a hunting accident. But John made a living for himself. He worked in filling stations, and he drove dry cleaner pickup and delivery trucks. And he made a living. Dorothy was 29 when she married.
Wow, that's really old. That's for the time, I mean.
Mm-hmm. She was probably the oldest of all of us to get married. Dorothy was, though she was the kindest person, she was heavy. I don't know, she was just almost naturally heavy.
A little over.
And very large breasts. And hair that was kind of sparse. Wasn't the long, luxurious locks that all the rest of us had. And she always felt that she was not attractive. It was hard for her to dress nicely because she had rather heavy hips, and she had these enormous breasts. Dolly Parton would have been glad. But Dorothy was a very, very kind person. She was not critical, she was not demanding, but if you got in jackpot with it, Dorothy was always trying to help you get squared away again. And she would loan you money, or she would do things, or she would call people, or she'd try and arrange things to make things better for us. very kind. And Pat was about the same way in disposition, and that Mother was awfully strict with Pat for some reason or other. Did some things that I wouldn't put in writing or on a tape or anything.
I
Pat,
can turn it off.
no. Well, yeah, well. And it left certain things to Mother, but it said that the balance of the estate was to be appraised and sold because Mother didn't want to stay on the ranch, and that the money, all of the assets, were to be divided equally among his 10 children.
Oh. Did that happen?
Dad died first,
So she got everything?
so Mother got everything.
When did he die?
He died in 1955, and Mother died in 1967. So she lived about 12 years after he died. And in a way, I thought, is she,
Actually, hold that thought. It just says that